The dusty hills of Afghanistan had witnessed many battles, but none like the one that forged an impossible bond between Staff Sergeant Miguel "Ghost" Rivera and a wounded leopard cub in 2003. 20 years later, as Miguel lay dying in his modest ranch house outside Tucson, Arizona, that same leopard was about to do something that would leave wildlife experts speechless and prove that some connections transcend all understanding of the natural world. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sonoran Desert as Dr. Patricia Chen delivered the news that Miguel already knew in his heart. The lung cancer, a cruel legacy from his years breathing the toxic smoke of burning oil fields in Iraq and the contaminated dust of Afghan battlefields, had spread beyond any hope of treatment. At 58, the decorated veteran who had survived 3 tours of duty and countless firefights would not survive this final battle. Miguel had always been a man of few words, but his weathered hands spoke volumes as they trembled slightly while Dr. Chen explained the timeline. 6 months, maybe less. The portable oxygen tank beside his bed hissed softly, a mechanical reminder of each labored breath. His wife Maria had died 2 years earlier from breast cancer, and their only son Carlos lived in Germany with his military unit. The ranch house that had once echoed with laughter now held only memories and the distant calls of desert wildlife. The property stretched across 47 acres of high desert terrain, dotted with mesquite trees and towering saguaro cacti. Miguel had purchased it with his disability pension and savings, drawn by its isolation and the way the landscape reminded him of the Afghan mountains where he had spent the most intense years of his life. Here, surrounded by the silence he had craved after years of warfare, he had found a measure of peace that had eluded him in crowded cities and busy suburbs. But peace had come at a price. The nightmares that haunted his sleep were filled with the faces of men he had lost, villages he had failed to protect, and children who had looked to him for safety in a world gone mad. The ranch became his sanctuary, a place where he could work with his hands, tend to injured wildlife that wandered onto his property, and slowly rebuild the parts of his soul that war had shattered. Miguel's reputation as a wildlife rehabilitator had spread quietly through the desert community. Ranchers would call when they found injured coyotes caught in fences. Hikers brought him desert tortoises with cracked shells. Park rangers knew that Miguel Rivera's place was where animals went to heal, tended by hands that understood suffering and the long road to recovery. His garage had been converted into a makeshift veterinary clinic, complete with surgical equipment purchased with his own money and medical knowledge learned through decades of battlefield first aid and veterinary courses taken at the local community college. The walls of his home office were covered with photographs and certificates that told the story of a life dedicated to service. His bronze star and purple heart sat in a simple frame beside pictures of the animals he had saved over the years. There were desert foxes, injured hawks, a family of javelinas, and dozens of other creatures that had found refuge on his land. But prominently displayed on his desk was a single photograph that seemed out of place among the desert wildlife images. The photo showed a much younger Miguel in military fatigues, his face lean and intense, holding a small leopard cub with distinctive rosette patterns and piercing amber eyes. The cub's left front paw was wrapped in military-issue bandages, and its expression was one of complete trust as it nestled against Miguel's chest. The background showed the rocky, barren landscape of eastern Afghanistan, and in the corner of the photo, someone had written in faded ink, "Kabul and Ghost, Kunar Province, October 2003. That photograph held the secret of Miguel's most extraordinary rescue, a story he had shared with only a handful of people over the years. During a patrol in the mountains near the Pakistani border, his unit had discovered a critically injured leopard cub, apparently orphaned and dying from infected wounds caused by shrapnel from a roadside bomb. Against all military protocols and the advice of his commanding officer, Miguel had carried the cub back to base, spending his off-duty hours nursing it back to health with medical supplies and pure determination. For 3 months, the cub he named Kabul had lived at the forward operating base, becoming an unofficial mascot and a source of joy for soldiers dealing with the daily stress of combat operations. Kabul's playful antics and obvious affection for Miguel provided moments of normalcy in an abnormal world. The leopard would sleep curled up next to Miguel's bunk, follow him around the base like a loyal dog, and even seem to understand when danger was approaching, becoming agitated before incoming mortar attacks. When Miguel's tour ended, the most difficult decision of his military career was leaving Kabul behind. Military regulations prohibited bringing exotic animals back to the United States, and Miguel knew that a semi-domesticated leopard could never survive in the Arizona desert. Working with local wildlife officials and conservation groups, he had arranged for Kabul to be relocated to a protected reserve in the Hindu Kush Mountains, where the young leopard could live freely among his own kind. The goodbye had been heartbreaking. Kabul had seemed to understand that something permanent was happening, clinging to Miguel with uncharacteristic desperation. As the transport vehicle pulled away, Miguel had watched through tears as the leopard pressed against the rear window, amber eyes locked on his face until distance made recognition impossible. It was an image that had haunted Miguel's dreams, both waking and sleeping, for 20 years. Now, as Dr. Chen packed her medical bag and prepared to leave, Miguel found himself thinking about that photograph and wondering what had become of the leopard cub he had saved so long ago. The doctor's words about experimental treatments and second opinions faded into background noise as Miguel's mind drifted back to those mountain paths in Afghanistan, where a bond had been forged that defied every rule of nature and military service. The weeks following Dr. Chen's diagnosis passed in a haze of phone calls, paperwork, and the gradual acceptance of mortality that comes to all soldiers who have stared death in the face too many times to fear it. Miguel's daily routine became a careful balance between managing his deteriorating health and maintaining the wildlife rehabilitation work that had given his post-military life meaning and purpose. His closest neighbor, Elena Vasquez, lived 3 miles down the dirt road that connected their properties to the main highway. A retired veterinary technician who had moved to the desert after her husband's death, Elena had become Miguel's unofficial partner in caring for injured animals. She possessed the medical expertise that complemented Miguel's intuitive understanding of animal behavior, and together they had saved hundreds of desert creatures over the past decade. Elena arrived each morning at sunrise, her battered pickup truck loaded with medical supplies, fresh water, and the strong coffee that had become their ritual before beginning the day's work. She was one of the few people who knew the full story of Miguel's military service, including the tale of the leopard cub in Afghanistan. Unlike others who might have dismissed such stories as the romanticized memories of an aging veteran, Elena understood the profound connections that could form between humans and animals in extreme circumstances. The third member of their small team was Danny Morales, a 26-year-old former Marine who had found his way to Miguel's ranch 2 years earlier. Danny carried his own invisible wounds from deployments in Syria and Iraq, and he had recognized in Miguel a kindred spirit who understood the weight of memories that civilian counselors could never fully comprehend. What had begun as an informal mentorship had evolved into a deep friendship built on shared experiences and mutual respect. Danny possessed skills that perfectly complemented the older veteran's knowledge. He was fluent with modern technology, maintaining detailed digital records of every animal they treated, creating social media pages that helped fund their operations through donations, and installing security cameras throughout the property to monitor the wildlife that came and went. His generation's comfort with documentation had created an invaluable archive of their rehabilitation work. The ranch itself had evolved over the years into a sophisticated operation despite its rustic appearance. The main house, built in the 1940s, retained its original adobe walls and red tile roof, but Miguel had added solar panels, a backup generator, and a water filtration system that could handle the desert's challenging conditions. Behind the house, a series of interconnected enclosures provided temporary homes for recovering animals, each designed to accommodate different species' specific needs. The garage-turned-clinic contained equipment that would have impressed many licensed veterinary practices. Surgical tables with proper lighting, refrigerated medication storage, digital X-ray equipment purchased from a bankrupt animal hospital, and even a small autoclave for sterilizing instruments. Miguel had invested every spare dollar of his disability pension into creating a facility that could handle everything from setting broken bones to performing emergency surgery on critically injured wildlife. Their patient records told stories of triumph and heartbreak that spanned nearly 15 years. There was the great horned owl that had arrived with a shattered wing and eventually flew free after 6 months of rehabilitation. The family of desert foxes whose den had been destroyed by construction equipment, requiring weeks of round-the-clock feeding before they could be relocated to suitable habitat. the ancient desert tortoise that had survived being hit by a car, living on the ranch for 3 years before being strong enough for release. Each successful release was celebrated like a military victory, complete with photographs, GPS tracking when possible, and detailed notes about the animal's condition and prognosis. Each death was mourned with the solemnity of a fallen comrade, their remains buried in a small cemetery beneath a grove of mesquite trees that Miguel had planted specifically for that purpose. The headstones were simple affairs, carved with dates and brief descriptions. Coyote Pup, found Highway 86, lived free for 2 weeks. Miguel's reputation had spread far beyond the immediate desert community. Wildlife biologists from the University of Arizona consulted with him on behavioral questions. The State Game and Fish Department regularly referred complex cases to his facility. Even zoos occasionally sought his advice on animals that were proving difficult to treat or rehabilitate. His lack of formal credentials was offset by decades of practical experience and an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that couldn't be taught in textbooks. The financial reality of running such an operation was constantly challenging. Miguel's disability pension covered basic living expenses, but medical supplies, specialized food, and equipment maintenance required constant fundraising. Elena contributed what she could from her veterinary technician pension, and Danny had organized online crowdfunding campaigns that brought in small but steady donations from animal lovers across the country. Local businesses had begun supporting their work as word spread about the ranch's mission. The feed store in Tucson provided bulk animal food at cost. A medical supply company donated expired but still usable medications. The veterinary college allowed Danny to audit courses in exchange for helping with their outreach programs. These relationships had created a network of support that sustained their operations even during difficult financial periods. The most rewarding aspect of their work was witnessing the moment when a healed animal recognized its freedom. Miguel had developed an uncanny ability to determine when a creature was ready for release, reading subtle changes in behavior and posture that indicated the transition from patient to wild animal. These releases were conducted with careful attention to location, season, and weather conditions to maximize each animal's chances of survival. As Miguel's health declined, the weight of this accumulated knowledge pressed heavily on his mind. 20 years of observation, technique, and hard-won wisdom about desert wildlife rehabilitation couldn't simply be written down in a manual. Elena and Danny were learning as much as possible, but Miguel worried about the animals that would suffer without the specialized care his ranch provided. The thought of closing the facility felt like abandoning a sacred trust. The progression of Miguel's illness accelerated with the brutal efficiency that cancer reserves for its most determined victims. What had begun as occasional shortness of breath during physical exertion quickly evolved into constant fatigue that made even simple tasks feel monumental. The portable oxygen concentrator became his constant companion, its steady mechanical rhythm marking time like a countdown clock that everyone could hear but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Chen's weekly visits brought a succession of adjustments to medications, discussions about pain management, and gentle suggestions about hospice care that Miguel consistently deflected. He had witnessed too many fellow veterans surrender to bureaucratic medical systems that treated dying as a process to be managed, rather than a final chapter to be lived with dignity. His ranch, his animals, and his work would remain his priorities until his body absolutely refused to cooperate. Elena found herself arriving earlier each morning and staying later each evening, quietly taking over the physical demands that Miguel could no longer handle. She lifted the heavier animals, mixed the bulk medications, and maintained the enclosures, while Miguel focused his diminishing energy on the diagnostic and treatment decisions that required his expertise. Their partnership had evolved into a seamless operation where words were often unnecessary. Communication flowing through glances and gestures developed over years of shared purpose. Danny's role expanded beyond documentation and fundraising into something approaching that of a field medic. His military training in emergency medicine, originally learned for treating wounded soldiers, translated surprisingly well to veterinary emergencies. Under Miguel's patient instruction, he learned to administer injections, monitor vital signs, and recognize the subtle symptoms that indicated when an animal's condition was deteriorating. The young veteran's steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure made him an invaluable asset during critical procedures. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The ranch's current patients included a red-tailed hawk with a compound fracture in its right wing, requiring twice-daily physical therapy sessions to prevent the joint from stiffening permanently. A family of javelinas had arrived after their mother was killed by a car, the 3 piglets requiring bottle feeding every 4 hours around the clock. An elderly coyote, probably struck by a vehicle weeks earlier, suffered from internal injuries that made eating painful and required a carefully monitored diet of specialized nutrition supplements. Each case demanded specific knowledge that Miguel had accumulated through decades of trial, error, and careful observation. The hawk's fracture required a particular splinting technique that maintained mobility while preventing further damage. The javelina piglets needed formula mixed to precise specifications. Too rich, and they would develop digestive problems. Too weak, and they would fail to thrive. The coyote's internal injuries required medications dosed according to body weight calculations that differed significantly from domestic dog protocols. Miguel's notebook, a thick leather-bound journal that had traveled with him through 3 military deployments and 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation, contained the accumulated wisdom that formal veterinary education rarely addressed. Page after page of handwritten observations detailed the behavioral changes that preceded recovery, the feeding schedules that worked best for different species, and the environmental modifications that reduce stress during healing. The notebook included detailed maps of release locations, carefully chosen for their proximity to water sources, appropriate shelter, and distance from human activity. Miguel had spent years learning the territorial patterns of local wildlife, understanding which areas could support additional animals without creating competition for limited resources. This knowledge couldn't be found in textbooks or learned through academic study. It required the patient observation of someone who had spent countless hours in the desert watching how animals actually lived. Recent entries in the notebook reflected Miguel's growing urgency to transfer this knowledge while he still possessed the mental clarity to explain the reasoning behind his methods. Elena and Danny took turns writing down his explanations, but Miguel worried that the subtle intuitions that guided his decisions couldn't be adequately captured in words. How could he explain the almost imperceptible change in a coyote's posture that indicated internal pain? What written description could convey the difference between an owl's distress call and its territorial warning? The physical demands of the work were becoming impossible to ignore. Tasks that Miguel had performed effortlessly for years now required careful planning and frequent rest breaks. Lifting a 40-pound coyote onto an examination table left him breathless and shaking. The combination of medications designed to manage his pain and reduce inflammation made his hands unsteady, creating dangerous situations when handling frightened or injured animals. Despite these limitations, Miguel refused to reduce the ranch's capacity or turn away animals in need. Every creature that arrived at their gate represented a life that could be saved, and his military background had instilled a commitment to mission accomplishment that transcended personal comfort. Elena and Danny watched with growing concern as Miguel pushed his failing body beyond reasonable limits, driven by a sense of responsibility that wouldn't allow him to acknowledge his own mortality. The financial pressures intensified as Miguel's medical expenses mounted alongside the ranch's operational costs. Insurance covered only a fraction of the specialized treatments and equipment his condition required, while the animal's needs remained constant regardless of their caretaker's health. Danny's fundraising efforts expanded to include benefit events at local VFW halls and social media campaigns that shared stories of successful rehabilitations, but the incoming donations barely covered the mounting expenses. Local veterinarians began offering their services at reduced rates, recognizing the value of Miguel's work and hoping to ease the burden on his deteriorating finances. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the largest animal hospital in Tucson, started making house calls to the ranch, bringing equipment and expertise that eliminated the need for expensive emergency visits. Her generosity extended to providing medications at cost and training Danny in advanced treatment techniques that would allow the ranch to handle more complex cases. The desert community's response to Miguel's situation revealed the depth of respect he had earned through years of quiet service. Hardware stores donated materials for enclosure repairs. Feed suppliers extended credit terms. Even competing wildlife rehabilitation facilities offered to take overflow cases rather than see animals suffer due to capacity limitations. This network of support sustained the ranch's operations, while Miguel focused his remaining energy on the knowledge transfer that would determine its future viability. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Elena's truck kicking up dust clouds as she navigated the winding dirt road to Miguel's ranch. But as she crested the small hill that overlooked the property, she slammed on her brakes, her heart pounding as she stared at an impossible sight. There, lying in the shade of the ancient mesquite tree near Miguel's bedroom window, was a large leopard with distinctive rosette patterns and piercing amber eyes. Danny arrived minutes later, his camera already recording as he approached the fence line with trembling hands. The leopard showed no signs of aggression or fear, simply watching the house with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. When Elena called the local wildlife authorities, the response was immediate disbelief, followed by urgent questions about security and public safety. No leopard had been reported missing from any zoo or private collection within 1,000 miles of Arizona. Miguel, confined to his hospital bed but alert enough to hear the commotion outside, asked to be moved to the window. When he saw the leopard, his weathered face transformed with an expression of wonder and recognition that took 20 years off his appearance. "Kabul," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the oxygen concentrator's mechanical breathing. "You came back." The leopard's behavior defied every principle of wild animal psychology. Instead of the territorial pacing or stress indicators that experts expected, Kabul demonstrated the relaxed alertness of an animal in familiar territory. He drank from the water dishes left for recovering wildlife, ignored the scent trails of other animals, and maintained a vigil that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation inside the house. Dr. Chen's emergency visit brought additional medical equipment and serious discussions about Miguel's rapidly declining condition. The excitement of seeing Kabul had temporarily energized the dying veteran, but his vital signs indicated that his body was beginning the final shutdown process. Elena and Danny took shifts at his bedside, recording his whispered instructions about animal care while documenting the unprecedented reunion occurring just beyond the window. Wildlife biologists from 3 universities converged on the ranch, bringing tracking equipment and theories about how a 20-year-old leopard could have traveled thousands of miles to find his former caretaker. Genetic testing of shed fur would later confirm what Miguel already knew in his heart. This was indeed the same cub he had rescued in the mountains of Afghanistan, somehow guided by instincts that science couldn't yet explain. The final encounter happened at sunrise on Miguel's last day. Elena and Danny carefully moved his bed to the covered porch, bringing him as close as possible to the leopard that had traveled impossibly far to say goodbye. Kabul approached the porch railing with the same confident stride he had shown as a cub exploring the military base, his amber eyes locked on Miguel's face with unmistakable recognition. Miguel raised his trembling hand toward the magnificent cat he had saved 2 decades earlier, and Kabul pressed his massive head against the veteran's palm through the porch railing. For several minutes, they remained connected in a moment that transcended species, language, and the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. Miguel's tears fell freely as he whispered words of gratitude and farewell in the mixture of English and Pashto he had used when Kabul was a frightened cub learning to trust again. As the sun climbed higher, Miguel's breathing became more labored, but his face remained peaceful. Kabul seemed to understand, settling into a resting position where he could maintain eye contact with the man who had given him a second chance at life. When Miguel passed away that afternoon, the leopard remained motionless for several hours before slowly rising, touching his nose once more to Miguel's still hand, and walking deliberately toward the desert hills. Elena and Danny continue operating the Miguel Rivera Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, using the detailed notebooks and video recordings he left behind. Kabul has never returned, but locals report occasional sightings of a large leopard in the distant mountains, always moving with purpose towards some unknown destination. The story of their reunion has inspired wildlife conservation efforts across the globe, proving that the bonds formed through compassion and respect can endure across decades and continents. Miguel's grave, marked by a simple stone beneath the mesquite tree where Kabul maintained his vigil, has become a pilgrimage site for veterans and animal lovers alike. The inscription reads simply, "Staff Sergeant Miguel Rivera. He saved those who could not save themselves." If this incredible story of loyalty and love across species moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of compassion, and let us know in the comments about your own experiences with the remarkable connections that exist in the natural world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that will restore your faith in the magic that surrounds us every day.